Okay, so we have our XERO Pure MAX here, and we are going to talk about all different ways that we troubleshoot issues that you may come across while using the MAX on the field. So, we're going to start off by talking about issues regarding flow. Now, we have to understand that flow through these systems starts at the source, or your inlet, what your water supply is. So, ultimately, these systems thrive on your source pressure and your source conditions, meaning how much GPM or gallons per minute you're getting out of your source, what temperature is the water, is it, it's groundwater, so a lot of times the water is colder as it's coming up, so temperature is something you want to keep in mind. At the same time, you want to verify that the hose that you are using to supply your system is at the proper specifications as far as diameter is concerned. So remember, when running your source water to your system, you want to be using standard garden hose with an inner diameter at a minimum of 5/8 or 3/4 of an inch. That way you're getting adequate flow into your system. So what we are going to do is we are going to run water into the system right now, just to get a baseline. So, things that affect flow. I mentioned temperature. So you want to understand that while this system can put up to 2 gallons per minute based on those source conditions, you have to bear in mind, what temperature is my water? 70-degree water is going to have an easier time traveling through filtration than 50-degree, let's say. Now, why is that? Well, we know how wood behaves in temperature. You have heat, causes expansion. You have cold, and it causes constriction. So your RO membranes are a lot like that if you want to consider them as structures that react to temperature. So when you're running cold water through RO membranes, what's happening is that you have a fiberglass construction that is allowing water to push through. Now, when that water's cold, we talked about constriction, it's going to have a tougher time running through the filtration. And on the same subject, you can get too cold of water, which causes freezing. And at that point, you're going to have lots of issues with flow and purification because the filters can't perform the way they are designed. So meaning, if you have a frozen system at this point, chances are the filter inside has cracked and forms where the water can't properly travel. So right there, you're going to have issues with flow, and your purification is going to suffer as well. So bear in mind the temperature that your water is when trying to figure out why my output isn't quite the same that I had at the previous job, for instance. So let's consider that we understand our source conditions, where we know our water temperature. Right now we're dealing with 55-degree water, so it's a little cold and my flow is going to be a little less than summertime. The next thing I want to look for, if I'm starting to notice a change in flow, is the first step of filtration in the system, which on all of our systems is the pre-filter, which is usually a carbon filter, or you might have a chloramine filter for that kind of harsher city water that uses chlorine-based chemicals to treat their water. Either way, this is your first stop in the system. And when a noticeable change of flow is noticed, more than likely it's time to change your carbon filter, as at this point, water is having a difficult time traveling through the filter because there's a lot of media in there. So you want to bear that in mind, change your carbon filter, especially if it's time to do so. If you're dealing with harsher water, you might have to change this filter a little more often. So that being said, change your carbon filter, and if the problem still persists, there are other things that we will then consider. So say we changed our carbon filter and our temperature is like 50-degree water. Well, now you know, okay, it may not necessarily be a problem with the machine itself, but I'm just at the mercy of my source. At the same token, when running water into your system, you know that you are trying to stop things from getting into your system. So you want to check for blockages too. That's something that we all tend to forget about sometimes, that we're not getting flow and we think there's a problem with the filter. It may actually be some blockage. The easiest way to tell is obviously, like we are doing now, we're running water into the system. I'm just going to currently turn that off. You're going to trace the plumbing of the system. So first step is into the carbon filter, and then you have these hoses that feed your RO housings. These hoses, while I won't disconnect them right now because I will get splashed, you can disconnect these hoses and make sure you're getting water flow out of there. I've had some rare cases where a little piece of debris got in to the push fit and no water was exiting the pre-filter. So by that point, checking for a simple blockage was the cure. So, following the Max, follow your plumbing. The Max has 2 RO housings that are fed from the top. And then the output of the pure water is coming out through this T-union that meets in the center. So you have one output that is met here. So you can check the flow from both of your ROs by simply disconnecting the center of the T-union here. Water will spill out, and typically it's going to be at a lesser rate than what you are getting out of your carbon filter. Why is that? Because the water's traveling through restriction. You have filters here. So bear in mind, it is going to be significantly less than what you would see out of this hose, but you should still see flow out of here. At the same token, you should also verify that you're getting flow out of your waste hose. First and foremost, wastewater will come out before your pure water will. So you want to make sure you're having flow out of here. Now, these restrictors at the bottom of your system are rated for 0.25 gallons per minute restriction. So you have 2 of those restrictors. You want to make sure that at the same token, the water that's coming out of here isn't like a fire hose, meaning that you have too much water coming out of your waste fittings. That would tell us that your restrictor has failed. It's not restricting anymore. And as a reminder, what that restriction does is allows the pressurization and purification to function the way it should. It needs a little bit of back pressure to allow the flow of water to both purify and separate, and for the ROs to perform healthily without choking on the debris that are being rejected. Because remember, this is your rejection line. So you have 0.25 gallons per minute of restriction coming out of both ends. You can measure the amount of water coming out of your waste hose. Simply take measuring cup. This one has liters and gallons. Typically we measure in gallons, but you could always convert to liters and vice versa if needed. And what you would do is you would measure water and time it for a minute to see how much water output comes out. And that tells you how many gallons per minute or liters per minute. And you can kind of gauge that and compare to the gallons per minute that you are getting out of your pure or out of your system. You want to have a 4-to-1 pure water to wastewater ratio to have an adequate use of the water that is used in your system. So you're not wasting too much water at the sake of purification, but you're also getting a good amount of flow through your system at that point. So that's why the restriction is set at that point. You want to make sure it's not exceeding the pure water, because right there, well, there's your loss of pure water flow too. Also, with your wastewater fittings, you always want to make sure that water is coming out of there. So if you run your system and no water's coming out, or you're seeing a drip like this, mind you, the system is off. But if you're seeing no water come out, that means you have a blockage in your system. And usually this is associated with more TDS issues, but at the same time, you might notice a little funky flow. Either way, these restrictor fittings are something you want to pay attention to in troubleshooting. No water means the ROs are being choked with concentrated salts and pure water, just mixed, and it doesn't really have anywhere to go. At that point, verify you have water coming out. If not, the restrictor has failed. You can replace the restrictor under warranty, or if you manage to clean it out with some alcohol, as silicone tends to get gunked up in there, you might be able to salvage the piece. So while we've touched upon the bottom of the system here with the wastewater flow, I'm also going to point out our pure water flow here. We mentioned that both of the pure water outlets meet at this T-union, but you have to understand you have two RO membranes here that are getting fed at the same time. It's possible that you may have a blockage that has traveled through one tube into one that's causing a little lack of flow versus the other. So one thing you can do is disconnect the T-union from each end to determine what kind of flow, and you can determine what kind of TDS, purification, that each RO is performing. So it's important to understand that you have a lot of connections here to pay attention to on your Max. So if we wanted to troubleshoot this RO, we would disconnect this hose, run water through the system, grab our TDS meter, see how the purification is going, and at the same token, you can measure that gallon per minute flow and compare it to your waste. It's 1-to-1. Outside of your RO housings, the final step in your system is your DI housing. It's a 10-inch resin cartridge sitting in this housing that accepts the RO water, purifies, and then you have the outlet of your system. So while you're tracing the plumbing to your system, you obviously want to make sure that you're having adequate flow into your DI housing. Mind you, it'll be significantly less than what's coming out of your pre-filter, but you want to make sure that it's not just a drip coming out. So verify your plumbing into your DI, and then with your DI housing, you want to make sure that your cartridge is sitting properly inside the housing to make a connection. So I'm going to point out our DI cartridge here. So the DI cartridge sits inside this bowl here that latches to the housing, and I'm just going to take out this cartridge here so you can see. So inside your DI bowl, it may be difficult to see, but there's a little notch sticking out that's supposed to align to the bottom end of your cartridge here. So when, say, you just replaced your resin, you want to make sure that cartridge is sitting properly inside the housing. So as you see, it can roll around in there. So making a proper connection is going to affect your purification and flow. Also, at the top of your cartridge, you'll notice a black O-ring or seal here. Now this seal is meant to, again, secure your connection. Secure the connection of water flowing through. If there is any damage, if that ring is not making a proper connection to the housing, then you're not having a secure connection and you're going to have some water slippage. So what does that mean? TDS and flow issues. Now, while this ring can come right out of the cartridge, it's important to utilize, and I say this anytime you are changing your filter, anytime you're inspecting this cartridge, take a little silicone lube. This silicone lube comes in your accessory bundle. And you want to lubricate your seals. Now, I just put some on my fingers here, and I'm sealing both ends here. And you want to make sure that this ring is placed nice and center on the cartridge. Make sure this ring is nicely seated in here. You'll also notice this ring has an imprint, much like yours will too. That kind of shows you where the connection is being made from this ring to the top of the cap. So a centered connection is good. You may notice that your connection might be a little askewed, or as it's tightening, part of the imprint is at the edge here, and the other end of the imprint is towards the other edge. That means it's a crooked connection. So, again, when you're troubleshooting, pay attention to these. When you're troubleshooting, pay attention to these factors, as the only way this thing is going to function properly is if it is sitting the way it's designed. While we are on the subject of resin, I should mention, much like your RO housings, your resin container is sitting in a closed, damp container. So if you're using this system once every 3 weeks, let's say, it sits for long periods of time. Then you go to run it, and you're having bad output. For some reason, this thing's putting out a trickle. One thing that occurs in closed housings with water is microbial growth. Now, microbial growth is the growth of bacteria, and these bacteria create biofilms. Think of it like a plastic shield, like goo. Anyway, biofilms are going to cause stoppages in flow, because it's literally bacteria growing inside a housing. So as far as your ROs are concerned, these filters, as it's tight media, if it's sitting for a long period of time, longer than 3 weeks, especially in the summertime with like warmer temperature, you're exposing these filters to bacterial growth. This can be combated with RO Guardian. Now that's the powder, the membrane preservative that comes with your system. And this is used to winterize your system, because in the winter, in colder areas, chances are you're not going to be running water into your system. That'll help protect and preserve these membranes for longer term storage. And at that point, that'll help protect from that bacterial growth. The same thing could be said about your resin container. Your resin container has resin beads. And resin beads, it's like a little sand. Resin purifies by separating charged ions. Just bear that in mind. So it's beads. And beads that sit in water for a long period of time swell. So if that resin chamber has just been sitting for a while, the charges have nowhere to go. The beads become saturated, and you're going to have a little lack of flow and purification. Because at that point, the purification process is only going from contact only. So think of, I have my dirt, he has his dirt, I make my contact, that's it. There's no absorption, there's nothing beyond that. It's like a lackluster purification. So bear that in mind with microbial growth. Those biofilms are going to affect your purification and your flow. So when in doubt, just change out your resin. Pack it in nice and tight. Make sure your seals are great and lubricated, and plug her back up. You'll be able to tell with your visual cues when removing the housing how well your cartridge was sitting in the housing itself. But afterwards, after your change, if you notice an improvement, well, there you go. You didn't have to go through extra steps beyond that point. So again, we talked about verifying seal and placement of your DI cartridge. And obviously this would be after checking every other aspect of flow to get yourself to the resin chamber. So you should be looking at this after you've checked your carbon filter. Obviously, you would have an understanding of how your membrane health is if you know how often you've been using it, how hard your water has been, and what kind of source conditions you're dealing with. Like is it winter time and you're using a well versus summer at city water. So all sorts of little factors to consider. Also, at the same token, never forget that the system is at the mercy of your source conditions. Your source water, your GPM, your temperature, and everything. Now, one thing you can do, because we're never going to know everybody's source conditions. We're never going to know how much water we're getting out of this house versus this house versus this house. It's always going to be a little different. So one thing you can do to help compensate is use a booster pump. Use a pump to boost your source water into your system, because these ROs will thrive on pressure. So the more water flow to help create restriction is going to create pressure, which is going to create more flow and purification. So it's helpful to have a booster pump on hand so you don't have to worry going place to place. Am I going to have enough pressure and flow to properly purify? That being said, you want to make sure you are always pumping into your system, not pumping out of your system. At that point, you're pulling from your membranes, you're pulling from your resin, you're actually damaging your filters, because a lot of these filters are intended to flow in one direction, and they are also meant to be pushed. So if you're pulling from that, you're actually risking further damage to your filters. So boost into your system. So that being said, we've touched on flow regarding the Max. We're going to talk about everything related to TDS with the XERO Pure MAX.